And we're back in, and we're back with Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Collins just proposed to Charlotte Lucas, and Elizabeth kind of thinks it's improper that he did that so soon after proposing to her. And she's a little ticked off about it. So let's continue on, chapter 23 of this beautiful book that I'm realizing more and more is so incredible. And so Charlotte, awkward conversation we left off with Charlotte and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was sitting with her mothers and sisters, reflecting on what she had heard and doubting whether she was authorized to mention it, when Sir William Lucas himself appeared, sent by his daughter to announce her engagement to the family. She said, "Yeah, it's interesting because the last time I saw you, you told me that my daughter would never be married." Actually, you said it really loudly in front of everybody. You said that she would never probably ever get married. And now look, she is married to the person that your daughter kind of, interestingly enough, declined, Mr. Collins. I didn't realize that they had just had that huge conversation where Mrs. Bennet was saying that the whole time out loud in front of people at a ball dinner. Sent my daughter engaged in the family. With many compliments to them and much self-congratulation on the prospect of a connection between the houses, he unfolded the matter. Ooh, let me unfold this matter. I like that saying. That's cool. He unfolded the matter to an audience not merely wondering but incredulous, for Mrs. Bennet, with more perseverance than politeness, protested it must be entirely mistaken. Protested he must be entirely mistaken, and Lydia, always unguarded and often uncivil, boisterously exclaimed, "Good Lord! Sir William, how can you tell such a story? Do you not know Mr. Collins wants to marry Lizzie?" Lydia and Mrs. Bennet are unhinged. Nothing less than the complacence of a courtier could have borne without anger such treatment, but Sir William Lucas's good breeding. It's my least favorite phrase of this whole time period. Sir William Lucas's good breeding carried him through it all, and though he begged leave to be positive as to the truth of his information, he listened to all their impertinence with the most forbearing courtesy. Wow, what a guy. That good breeding. Elizabeth, feeling incumbent on her to relieve him from so unpleasant a situation as her family. I know my family can be unpleasant. Now put herself forward to confirm his account by mentioning her prior knowledge of it from Charlotte herself, and endeavoured to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sisters by the earnestness of her congratulations to Sir William, in which she was readily joined by Jane, and making a variety of marks on the happiness that might be expected from the match. That's very polite of her. The excellent character of Mr. Collins, and the convenient distance of Hunsford from London. Wow. Mrs. Bennet was in fact too much overpowered to say a great deal while Sir William remained, but no sooner had he left them than her feelings found a rapid vent. In the first place, she persisted in disbelieving the whole of the matter. Secondly, she was very sure that Mr. Collins had been taken in. Thirdly, she trusted that they would never be happy together. And fourthly, that the match might be broken off. Two inferences, however, were plainly deduced from the whole. One, that Elizabeth was the real cause of the mischief, and the other, that she herself had been barbarously misused by all of them. And on these 2 points she principally dwelt during the rest of the day. Nothing could console and nothing could appease her, nor did that day wear out her resentment. A week elapsed before she could see Elizabeth without scolding her. A month passed before she could speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude, and many months were gone before she could at all forgive their daughter. Her least favorite daughter, Elizabeth. She's going to regret that soon. Spoiler alert. Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion, and such as he did experience he pronounced to be of a most agreeable sort. For it gratified him, he said, to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. Jane confessed herself a little surprised at the match, but she said less of her astonishment than of her earnest desire for their happiness. The greatest interpretation, Jane. Very good. Nor could Elizabeth persuade her to consider it as improbable. Kitty and Lydia were far from envying Miss Lucas, for Mr. Collins was only a clergyman, and it affected them in no other way than as a piece of news to spread at Meryton. Lady Lucas could not be insensible of triumph on being able to retort on Mrs. Bennet the comfort of having a daughter well married, because none of hers are now. That she, golly, can you even imagine Mrs. Bennet going around saying, like, she's gonna get married in 3 or 4 months, and the guy's gone. He's pieced out. And she called at Longbourn rather oftener than usual to say how happy she was, though Mrs. Bennet's sour looks and ill-natured remarks might have been enough to drive happiness away. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte, there was a restraint which kept them mutually silent on the subject, and Elizabeth felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between them again. When friendships lost. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her turn with fonder regard to her sister, of whose rectitude and delicacy she was sure her opinion could never be shaken, and for whose happiness she grew daily more anxious, as Bingley has now been gone a week, and nothing more was heard of his return. Jane had sent Caroline an early answer to her letter, and was counting the days till she might reasonably hope to hear again. The promised letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived on Tuesday, addressed to their father, and written with all the solemnity of gratitude which a 12 months' abode in the family might have prompted. He's over-gracious, which seems like not a virtue in this scenario. After discharging his conscience on that head, he proceeded to inform them, with many rapturous expressions, of his happiness in having obtained the affection of their amiable neighbour, Miss Lucas, and then explained that it was merely with the view of enjoying her society that he had been so ready to close with their kind wish of seeing him again at Longbourn, whither he hoped to be able to return on Monday fortnight. For Lady Catherine, he added, so heartily approved his marriage that she wished it to take place as soon as possible, which he trusted would be an unanswerable argument with his amiable Charlotte to name an early day for making him the happiest of men. Mr. Collins' return into Hertfordshire was no longer a matter of pleasure to Mrs. Bennet. On the contrary, she was as much disposed to complain of it as her husband. It was very strange that he should come to Longbourn instead of to Lucas Lodge. It was also very inconvenient and exceedingly troublesome. She hated having visitors in the house while her health was so indifferent, and lovers were of all people the most disagreeable. Lovers are the most disagreeable. That's so funny. Just be happy for other people. Such were the gentle murmurs of Mrs. Bennet, and they gave way only to the greater distress of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Sad, neither Jane nor Elizabeth were comfortable on this subject. Day after day passed away without bringing any other tidings of him than the report which shortly prevailed in Meryton of his coming no more to Netherfield the whole winter. A report which highly incensed Mrs. Bennet, and which she never failed to contradict as a most scandalous falsehood. Even Elizabeth began to fear, not that Bingley was indifferent, but that his sisters would be successful in keeping him away. Unwilling as she was to admit an idea so destructive of Jane's happiness, and so dishonourable to the stability of her lover, she could not prevent its frequently occurring. The united efforts of his 2 unfeeling sisters and of his overpowering friend, Mr. Darcy, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusement of London, might be too much. She feared for the strength of his attachment. As for Jane, her anxiety under this suspense was, of course, more painful than Elizabeth's, but whatever she felt was desirous of concealing. And between herself and Elizabeth, therefore, the subject was never alluded to. But as no such delicacy restrained her mother, an hour seldom passed in which she did not talk of Bingley, express her impatience for his arrival, or even require Jane to confess that if he did not come back, she would think herself very ill-used. It needed all Jane's steady mildness to bear these attacks with intolerable tranquillity. Mr. Collins returned most punctually on Monday fortnight, but his reception at Longbourn was not quite so gracious as it has been on his first introductions. He was too happy, however, to need much attention, and luckily for the others, the business of love-making relieved them from a great deal of his company. Whoa, I missed that was even in there. He was too happy over to need much attention, and luckily for the others, the business of lovemaking relieved them from a great deal of his company. Whoa, that's like really straightforward for this time. Mrs. Bennet, no, lovemaking. I got really distracted by the Mr. Collins' lovemaking. The chief of every day was spent by him at Lucas Lodge, and he sometimes returned to Longbourn only in time to make an apology for his absence before the family went to bed. Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. The very mention of anything concerning the match threw her in agony of ill humour, and wherever she went she was sure of hearing it talked of. The sight of Miss Lucas was odious to her. As her successor in that house, she regarded her with jealous abhorrence. Whenever Charlotte came to see them, she concluded her to be anticipating the hour of possession. Whoa. And whenever she spoke in a low voice to Mr. Collins, was convinced that they were talking of the Longbourn estate, and resolving to turn herself and her daughters out of the house as soon as Mr. Bennet were dead. She complained bitterly of all this to her husband. Indeed, Mr. Bennet, said she, it is hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her and live to see her take her place in it. My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor. I'll never die. Don't you worry, I'll never die. This was not very consoling to Mrs. Bennet, and therefore, instead of making any answer, she went on as before. I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it. What should you not mind? I should not mind anything at all. Let us be thankful that you are preserved from a state of such insensibility. I never can be thankful, Mr. Bennet, for anything about the entail. How anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand. And all for the sake of Mr. Collins, too. Why should he have it more than anybody else? I leave it to yourself to determine, said Mr. Bennet. Very comforting. Very comforting. Good. Very good, Mr. Bennet. Chapter 14, XX, IV 14, 20 minus plus 5 minus 4, 14, 24. Miss Bingley's letter arrived and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friends in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over, and when Jane could attend to the rest of the letter, she found little except for the professional affection of the writer that could give her any comfort. Miss Darcy's praise occupied the chief of it. Her many attractions were again dwelt on, and Caroline boasted joyfully of their increased intimacy, and ventured to predict the accomplishment of the wishes which had been unfolded in her former letter. She wrote also with great pleasure of her brother's being an inmate of Mr. Darcy's house, and mentioned with raptures some plans of the latter with regard to new furniture. Elizabeth, to whom Jane would very soon communicated the chief of all this, heard it in silent indignation. Her heart was divided between concern for her sister and resentment against all others. To Caroline's assertion of her brother's being partial to Miss Darcy, she paid no credit. There was that he was really fond of Jane, she doubted no more than she had ever done, and much as she had always been disposed to like him, she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on that easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him the slave of his designing friends, and led him to sacrifice of his own happiness to the caprice of their inclination. Had his own happiness, however, been the only sacrifice, he might have been allowed to sport with it in whatever manner he thought best. But his sisters were involved in it, as she thought he must be sensible himself. It was a subject, in short, on which reflection would be long indulged, and must be unavailing. She could think of nothing else. And yet whether Bingley's regard had really died away, or were suppressed by his friend's interference, whether he'd been aware of Jane's attachment, or whether it had escaped his observation, whatever were the case, though her opinion of him must be materially affected by the indifference, her sister's situation remained the same, her peace equally wounded. A day or two passed before Jane had courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth, but at last, on Mrs. Bennet's leaving them together, after a long interrogation a longer interrogation than usual about Netherfield and its master, she could not help saying, "Oh, that my dear mother had more command over herself." Whoa. Wishing somebody had more command over themselves. That's deep. She can have no idea of the pain she gives me by her continual reflections on him. But I will not repine. I cannot last long. It cannot last long. He will be forgot, and we shall all be as we were before. Elizabeth looked at her sister with incredulous solicitude, but said nothing. "You doubt me," cried Jane, slightly colouring. "Indeed, you have no reason. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, but that is all. I have nothing either to hope nor fear, and nothing to reproach him with. Thank God, I have not that pain. A little time, therefore, I shall certainly try to get the better." With a stronger voice, she soon added, "I have this comfort immediately, that it has not been more than an error of fancy on my side, and that it has done no harm to anyone else but myself." "My dear Jane," exclaimed Elizabeth, "you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I had never done you justice or loved you as you deserve." Miss Bennet eagerly disclaimed all extraordinary merit, and threw back the praise on her sister's warm affection. "Nay," said Elizabeth, "this is not fair. You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. I only want to think you perfect, and you set yourself against it. Do not be afraid of my running into any excess, or of my encroaching on your privilege of universal goodwill. You need not. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer who I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it, and every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters, and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of merit or sense. I have met with 2 instances lately. One I will not mention. The other is Charlotte's marriage. It is uncountable. In every view it is uncountable. My dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness. You do not make allowance enough for difference of situation and temper. Consider Mr. Collins' respectability and Charlotte's steady, prudent character. Remember that she is one of a large family, that as to fortune, it is a most eligible match, and be ready to believe, for everybody's sake, that she may feel something like regard and esteem for our cousin. To oblige you, I would try to believe almost anything, but no one else could be benefited by such a belief as this. For were I persuaded that Charlotte had any regard for him, I should only think worse of her understanding than I now do of her heart. My dear Jane, Mr. Collins is conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man. You know he is, as well as I do, and you must feel as well as I do that the woman who married him cannot have a proper way of thinking. Eesh. You shall not defend her, though it is Charlotte Lucas. You shall not, for the sake of one individual, change the meaning of principle and integrity, nor endeavour to persuade yourself or me that selfishness is prudence, and insensible of danger security for happiness. I must think your language too strong in speaking of both, replied Jane, and I hope you will be convinced of it by seeing them happy together. But enough of this. You alluded to something else. You mentioned 2 instances. I cannot misunderstand you, but I entreat you, dear Lizzie, not to pain me by thinking that person to blame, and say your opinion of him is sunk. We must not be so ready to fancy ourselves intentionally injured. We must not expect a lively young man to be always so guarded and circumspect. It is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does. Women fancy admiration means more than it does. I see. And men take care that they should. If it is designedly done, they cannot be justified, but I have no idea of there being so much design in the world as some persons imagine. I am far from attributing any part of Mr. Bingley's conduct of design, said Elizabeth, but without scheming to do wrong or to make others unhappy, there may be error, and there may be misery. Thoughtlessness, want of attention to other people's feelings, and want of resolution will do the business. And do you impute it to either of those? Do you impute it to either of those? Yes, to the last, but if I go on, I shall displease you by saying what I think of persons you esteem. Stop me whilst you can. You persist, then, in supposing his sister's influence on him? Yes, in conjunction with his friend. I cannot believe it. Why should they try to influence him? They can only wish his happiness, and if he is attached to me, no other woman can secure it. Your first position is false. They may wish many things besides his happiness. They may wish his increase of wealth and consequence. They may wish him to marry a girl who has all the importance of money, great connections, and pride. Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy, replied Jane. But this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. They have known her much longer than they have known me. No wonder if they love her better. But whatever may be their own wishes, it is very unlikely they should have opposed their brothers. What sister would think herself at liberty to do it, unless there was something very objectionable? If they believed him attached to me, they would not try to part us. If he was so, they could not succeed. By supposing such an affection, you make everybody acting unnaturally and wrong, and me most unhappy. Do not distress me by the idea. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken, or at least it is light. It is nothing in comparison of what I should feel in thinking ill of him or his sisters. Let me take it in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood. Elizabeth could not oppose such a wish, and from this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. Mrs. Bennet still continued to wonder and repine at his returning to no more, and though a day seldom passed in which Elizabeth did not account for it clearly, there was little chance of her ever considering it with less perplexity. Her daughter endeavoured to convince her of what she did not believe herself, that his intentions to Jane had been merely the effect of a common and transient liking, which ceased when he saw her no more. But though the probability of the statement was admitted at the time, she had the same story to repeat every day. Mrs. Bennet's best comfort was that Mr. Bingley must be down again in the summer. We're all hoping for the best. He'll be coming back. It's going to be fine. Mr. Bennet treated the matter differently. So, Lizzie, said he one day, your sister is crossed in love, I find. I congratulate her. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed in a little love now and then. It is something to think of, and it gives her a sort of distinction among her companions. When is your turn to come? You will hardly bear me long outdone by Jane. You will hardly bear to be long outdone by Jane. Now is your time. Here are officers enough in Meryton to disappoint all the young ladies in the country. Let Wickham be your man. He's a pleasant fellow, and would jilt you creditably. Thank you, sir, but a less agreeable man would satisfy me. We must not all expect Jane's good fortune. True, said Mr. Bennet, but it is a comfort to think that whatever of that kind may befall you, you have an affectionate mother who will make the most of it. That's a good line. Mr. Wickham's society was of material service in dispelling the gloom which the late preserve occurrences had thrown on many of the Longbourn family. They saw him often, and to his other recommendations was now added that of general unreserve. The whole of what Elizabeth had already heard, his claims on Mr. Darcy, and all that he had suffered from him, was now openly acknowledged and publicly canvassed, and everybody was pleased to know how much they had always disliked Mr. Darcy before they had known anything of the matter. I don't like that Mr. Wickham's just gossiping around town, though. Miss Bennet was the only creature who could suppose there might be any extenuating circumstances in the case, unknown to the society of Hertfordshire. Her mild and steady candour always pleaded for allowances and urged the possibility of mistakes, but by everybody else Mr. Darcy was condemned as the worst of men. And that's the end of the book. Just kidding. Do we want to go on? Shall we continue? Oh, very small chapter indeed. 25. Woo! After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins was called from his amiable Charlotte by the arrival of Saturday. The pain of separation, however, might be alleviated on his side by preparations for the reception of his bride, as he had reason to hope that shortly after his return to Hertfordshire, the day would be fixed that was to make him the happiest of men. I love that she keeps using that. He keeps saying that it's going to make him the happiest of men. Marriage is going to make him the happiest of men. That's so funny. He took leave of his relations at Longbourn with as much solemnity as before, wished his fair cousins health and happiness, and promised their father another letter of thanks. No, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you, but no thank you for a letter of thanks from you. It's enough. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade, and in view of his own warehouse, could have been so well-bred and agreeable. Fine. Ugh. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest and herself especially, there subsisted a particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. The first part of Mrs. Gardiner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. Ooh. When this was done, she had a less active part to play. It became her to listen. It became her turn to listen. I wonder what it is when you just skip words and fill in words that aren't there. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate and much to complain of. They had all been very ill-used since she last saw her sister. Two of her girls had been upon the point of marriage, and after all, there was nothing in it. I do not blame Jane, she continued, for Jane would have got Mr. Bingley if she could. But Lizzie, oh sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time, had it not been her own perverseness. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him. The consequence of it is that Lady Lucas will now have a daughter married before I have, and that the Longbourn estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. Oh, I don't like that description. I am sorry to say it of them, but it is so. But so it is. I am sorry to say it of them, but so it is. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted and so by my own family, and to have neighbours who think of themselves before anybody else. However, your coming just at this time is the greatest of comforts, and I am very glad to hear what you tell us of long sleeves. The new fashion, long sleeves. Mrs. Gardner, to whom the chief, compared to now, where it's like, this is in, now it's out. This is in, now it's out. This is in, now it's out. I wonder how long sleeves are in. And it was just traveled by word of mouth. Took a long time to get round. Mrs. Gardner, to whom the chief of this news had been given before, in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, made her sister a slight answer, and, in comparison to her nieces, turned the conversation. When alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke more on the subject. It seems likely that to have been a desirable match for Jane, said she. I am sorry it went off, but these things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe, Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and then when accident separates them, so easily forgets her. That these sort of inconsistencies are frequent. An excellent consolation in its way, said Elizabeth, but it will not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before. But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise from a half-hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love? I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people, and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be a finer symptom? Is not general incivility the very essence of love? General incivility is the very essence of love. Oh, yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane, I am sorry for her, because with her disposition she may not get over him immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed upon to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything. Elizabeth was exceedingly pleased with this proposal, and felt persuaded of her sister's ready acquiescence. I hope, added Mrs. Gardner, that no consideration with regard to this young man will influence her. We live in so different parts of town, all our connections are so different, and, as you well know, we go out so little, that it is very improbable that they should meet at all, unless he really comes to see her. And that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him to call on Jane in such a part of London. My dear aunt, how could you think of it? Mr. Darcy may perhaps have heard of such a place as Gracechurch Street, but he would hardly think a month's ablution. A month's ablution. What does ablution mean? Ablution. Ablution. Something about money, is it? An act of washing oneself? Often used for humorously formal effect. Whoa, ablution. I've never heard that word in my life. A month's washing. Enough to cleanse him from its impurities, were he once to enter it. And depend upon it, Mr. Bingley never stirs without him. Whoa, a month's washing couldn't cleanse him enough from its impurities. Whoa. So much the better. I hope they will not meet at all. But does not Jane correspond with his sister? She will not be able to help calling. She will drop the acquaintance entirely. But in spite of the certainty in which Elizabeth affected to place this point, as well as the still more interesting one of Bingley's being withheld from seeing Jane, she felt a solicitude on the subject, which convinced her on examination that she did not consider it entirely hopeless. It was possible, and sometimes she thought it probable, that his affection might be reanimated and the influence of his friends successfully combated by the more natural influences of Jane's attractions. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Bingleys were no otherwise in her thoughts at the same time. Then, as she hoped by Caroline's not living in the same house with her brother, she might occasionally spend a morning with her without any danger of seeing him. The Gardiners stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses and the Lucases and the officers, there was not a day without its engagement. Mrs. Bennet had so carefully provided the entertainment of her brother and sister that they did not once sit down to a family dinner. When the engagement was for home, some of the officers always made part of it, and which officers Mr. Wickham was sure to be one, and on these occasions Mrs. Gardiner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation, narrowly observed them both, without supposing them, from what she saw, to be very seriously in love. Their preference of each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy, and she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on the subject before she left Hertfordshire, and represent to her the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment. To Mrs. Gardiner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure, unconnected with his general powers. About 10 or a dozen years ago, before her marriage, she had spent a considerable time in that very part of Derbyshire to which he belonged. They had therefore many acquaintances in common, and though Wickham had been little there since the death of Darcy's father, it was yet in his power to give her fresher intelligence of her former friends than she had been in the way of procuring. Mrs. Gardiner had seen Pemberley, and known the late Mr. Darcy by character perfectly well. Here, consequently, was an inexhaustible subject of discourse, in comparing her recollection of Pemberley with the minute description which Wickham could give, and in bestowing her tribute of praise on the character of its late possessor, she was delighting both him and herself. On being made acquainted with the present Mr. Darcy's treatment of him, she tried to remember something of that gentleman's reputed disposition when quite a lad which might agree with it, and was confident at last that she recollected having heard Miss Fitzwilliam Darcy formerly spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy. Wow. What do you even say to that? Confirmation biases, people's personalities. Interesting. All right, everybody, happy reading. Catch you next time. We'll talk chapter freaking 26. How exciting.